Incoming transmission from an unknown source. It seems to be urgent. Patching them through. They're calling themselves the HoloNet Marauders.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the HoloNet Marauders podcast. I'm AJ, and I'm joined here by Mythological Matt today.
Wow, is that my name? Do I have to change my name now?
Yeah, you might have to on that thing. It always says Marauder Matt, but today it might say Mythological Matt. So, because I said that, this is a big episode for Matt, and it's gonna be a cool episode for our channel. But we're gonna be talking about mythology and themes in Star Wars, which, if you listen to our podcast regularly, you'll know that's like Matt's bread and butter. It's his favorite thing. For me and for Jamie, it's kind of like a secondary thing. Like, it's not in the forefront of our mind when we're enjoying Star Wars. It's a very cool thing that when I step back, at least I can see it. And since knowing Matt better, the last like handful of years, we've become good friends. Like, he points these things out to us on the podcast and just in general as friends. I'm like, oh, it's really cool to see it from that point of view. We do roll our eyes at him a lot, but it's all in good fun. Whenever I roll my eyes at anyone or give anyone any sort of sass or anything, it's always, I'm never, as Matt always says, he never says anything serious. Like, I never really do either. Like, especially when it comes to Star Wars. Yeah, we may disagree on things, but like, yeah, I say that to people all the time. Don't take yourself too seriously. But yeah, with that being said, mythology and all the general themes in Star Wars is what we're going to talk about today. And you're going to hear a lot of Matt because this is his bread and butter. I don't want to think of it as like I'm interviewing him, but it's kind of going to be that, like, I'm going to be spitting ideas off him and he's just going to be going. But
I'll try.
Matt, how happy are you that we're doing this episode?
I'm very happy. I love doing this kind of stuff. I could talk about that. We could do like 10 episodes on this stuff, and it would just be just
maybe we will,
like a stream of consciousness, just over and over again. Watch me be like silent and speechless this whole episode. Just be like, I don't know.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. That would be a great episode. And I'd be over here like that. Somehow I turn into the mythological AJ over here. But
there you go. Yeah,
and he did change his name. If you're a listener, we have our names on the thing, and mine says AJ and his says Mythological Matt now. So
yours says AJ. Wow.
Yeah, it used to say.
It used to be
HoloNet Marauder for some reason.
It used to be our Twitter or our handle. I'll just say our handle.
Yeah, our handle. But so I do have a question before we get into all this stuff, like a general question, because for me, like, people might be wondering, like, oh, AJ, if someone out there is like, I love the mythological stuff in Star Wars and all those kind of things, and I really look for themes in Star Wars, like, that's what I like they'd be like, AJ, what do you like? And I mean, I don't want to say I take it at surface level, but like, I kind of do. Like, I enjoy it within its own universe or galaxy, whatever you want to call it. And I'm just there for the stories. Like, maybe I'm a pea brain or something, and I just like it like that. But
no, that's not how that works.
A good
I would
comparison,
say the majority digest Star Wars like you do.
Probably, but yeah, most definitely. But the way I enjoyed it as a kid is kind of the same way I do enjoy it now. I do, obviously, as a kid, maybe I didn't like dialogue and that kind of stuff. But like, now I really like that stuff. Like, would I have liked Andor as a kid? Probably. Still, I was kind of a weird kid. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't think I would have liked Andor as a kid. I
like things like James Bond as a kid, but I like the action. But I
like James Bond too as a kid. But yeah, it was because of the action. But Andor has action, but not a lot of it.
Also, there's a lot of dryness in there. Good dryness.
There's a lot of dryness, and there's a lot of social commentary that I, as a kid, would never have picked up on.
Well, that's the thing you're getting to, though. Like, that's enjoying the outside influence of it, which
True.
Is like that's what we're getting to today.
I will say this. It absolutely baffles me that you don't see Andor for the social and political commentary that Andor produced was like the first thing I saw and the thing that made me love it so much.
The Andor, I didn't expect us to immediately be talking about Andor. That's what the beauty of this is. Like, this isn't really scripted. We just got into this
stream of consciousness discussion.
Yeah, Andor It is a lot more obvious in Andor. But like I will say, when we do podcast episodes, the reviews of each episode, me, you, Jack, and Jamie did them. You know, you guys did bring up a lot of things where I'm like, oh, I didn't really think of it that way, which is good. I like to hear. I like to learn things from each other. That's a cool thing of doing this.
Well, yeah.
But I mean, that show, it's a little more blatant and in your face. But anyways, my question, I'm going all the way around here, to you is like, when did you really start to shift gears? Because I imagine you didn't always look at all this outside influence on Star Wars and all the mythological stuff and the themes. When did you really shift gears into loving that?
I will say, actually, I have always. When I was 4 years old in the theater watching The Phantom Menace, I was taking notes. I had a little notepad and I was writing down like, oh yeah,
you had the hero's journey with you.
Represents the pathos, and yeah, no. Well, I started really getting into film in high school, like just film in general. And since Star Wars was like the films that I watched as a kid the most, just constantly on repeat, I sort of just kind of gravitated towards watching Star Wars with that like film lens in mind when I started developing like an actual interest in writing in films for like messaging and themes and stuff like that, instead of just like the surface level like action and fun that I used to enjoy when I was a kid. But like, funny enough, the Angry Video Game Nerd, who I actually got to meet this year, which was very exciting. He made a video, 2 videos on Star Wars. And I think I was a freshman in high school or I was in 8th grade when they came out. And that was like the height of my Angry Video Game Nerd, or James Rolfe, that's his name, that fandom. I was super into him at the time. And he released these two videos on Star Wars. And he started talking about the parallels. Now, when I was a kid, my dad, every time I would talk to my dad, he would always say the same thing to me. He'd say, because I always used to think Star Wars and Star Trek were like rivalry franchises that like hated each other and like they were the same thing. So you could only like one or the other. You couldn't like both. And I always used to rag on my dad because he liked both. And he always used to say, well, Star Trek is sci-fi, but Star Wars is just a space Western. And I always used to get pissed at him when I was a kid because I could not understand that concept. And I used to be like, yeah, that's nonsense. There's no cowboys. There's no funny hats and horses, and it doesn't take place in the West. So I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. Shut up. And one day he actually did sit me down and he played like the theme from the Magnificent Seven. And then he played Star Wars. And I think that was like 7th or 8th grade. And that was when it like clicked. I was like, holy crap, this music is Western music, but like repackaged to be like more triumphant and like almost like warlike, or like a World War II movie would have like these like really triumphant, bombastic scores mixed with a Western. And when I watched the James Rolfe videos, he did the same thing. He showed all these clips from different Western movies and then put them in the context of Star Wars. And it like hit me right then. I was like, oh my God, this is a Western. And then it's a World War II movie. And oh my God, it's a fantasy, holy crap, it's Merlin and there's a farm boy and he finds a sword and he goes on a quest to save a princess from a fortress. And it's samurai movies. Holy crap. And then I sat down and I watched all the, Hidden Fortress and Seven Samurai and Seven Samurai connects to the Magnificent Seven and Westerns were like cannibalizing samurai movies, and samurai movies were cannibalizing Western movies at the same time. If you watch like Django, like the original Django movies from the 1960s, not Django Unchained, that kind of riffs off of those, but like the original Django movie from like 1960, that movie is a remake of the Seven Samurai. Seven Samurai? Pretty sure it's the Seven Samurai. It's a remake of a samurai movie, which is funny because the movie that it was remaking was riffing off of like Westerns from the 30s and 40s. So it was like a cycle. The Western movies would influence the samurai movies, which would influence the next generation of spaghetti Westerns, which then influenced Star Wars. So all of a sudden you had, warrior monks that act like samurai, who George Lucas describes as marshals from the Old West, roaming the galaxy with their, sabers, right? They didn't have guns, they have sabers. So they're knights, they're Jedi knights that have like, that practice in like temples, they practice their religion in temples. So it's like Buddhism And then you jump into like the philosophical angles of like the Force, and like how does that connect to our real life religions and like Buddhism, the whole like non-attachment part of the Jedi is directly based on non-attachment principles of Buddhism. And Taoism, if you know anything about Taoism or the Tao is literally the way. And it's basically on like the very surface level, guys, because I am not a Taoist. I want to put that out right now. I'm just going to say from like the most surface level reading of the religion, you could get much deeper. But the Tao just means the way. And the way is just like a way of nature of how things are, how things just must be. And to practice in the most pure sense, you have to follow kind of just the way. And that's the same thing as like, well, it's not the same thing, but the will of the Force definitely riffs off that idea. Taoism is definitely a huge driver in like what the Force actually is. And if we look at Stoicism, which was like an ancient Greek philosophical practice like way back in the day, Stoicism is the same kind of way. It was like a rationalization or rational thinking where people were encouraged to see, when you think of Stoics, you think of somebody who's just like not like emotional at all, like no emotion, just plain like stoic, right? It's kind of, that term has kind of become that. But it really just meant looking at things in a rational manner, removing a lot of emotion from it, but not all of it, because you can't remove all of it. And a rationalist would know that you cannot remove all emotion from a situation. And so Stoicism believed in looking at things following some kind of natural order that through rationalism you could kind of see. I'm not doing the greatest job of explaining it, but the basic principle was you had to remove as much subjectivity as possible to look at the most objective truth of how things function. And it was very much in a similar manner to Taoism in terms of like, there is a natural order of things, there is a way things happen, so we must see that through, practicing containing our emotions, understanding what our emotions do. And that's very Jedi. Yeah. Like, again, and again, people often very much misunderstand what the Jedi are, I think.
That's something that's a big deal, I think, because
that's a big deal to me. I talk about
like,
that all the time.
No, yeah, and I agree. Like, people do forget what a Jedi is. Like, oh, a Jedi, like, they should be out there fighting someone. They should be out there, like, but like the whole idea is they don't want to fight, and like
they don't want to fight. They've been the brilliance of the prequels. The brilliance of that is that, like, the Jedi are kind of trapped. If they sit out of the war, they're letting so much countless suffering be caused by an organization they know is run by the Sith. They know that the CIS is controlled by a Sith Lord and his apprentice Dooku, who has a red lightsaber and is doing nefarious things. It's not that hard to come to the conclusion that he is a Sith, and the Jedi do understand that by the beginning of the Clone Wars. So you understand that the Jedi know that the Sith are running the CIS. They're running the opposition to the Republic. So you have to understand that, yes, the Jedi have to fight that. The Sith are the unnatural twisting of the Force. The Force is brought out of balance by an overabundance of Sith influence on the galaxy. And we could get into what balance of the Force really means all day, because there are a lot of different interpretations, because George Lucas never really specified, except for saying that more or less balance in the Force is the absence of the Sith. Or more accurately, George said that Anakin killing Palpatine and then dying, a Jedi, cut the line of the Sith off and balanced the Force. And a lot of people think that means that no Sith equals balance in the Force. And I think it's a little more tricky, nuanced than that.
Yeah.
My personal interpretation is a lack of influence of the dark side on the galaxy. So as minimal suffering as possible. And usually the Sith bring about that kind of suffering that imbalances the Force. But I think it has more to do with peace. So no war, right? No galactic war. And
which is not very often, or time of no war in Star Wars isn't too often of a thing, but yeah.
Too often of a thing unless you lived before 32 BBY. Because then it was 1,000 years of no war. And the Nile, you can kind of talk about the Nile or the Path of the Open Hand, because they kind of bring about violence and chaos. And I do think balancing is like a scale. It's not a simple binary balanced or unbalanced. I think there is like a tipping point where an overabundance of suffering and violence and war can tip the scales. And by the time Palpatine rolls around, the scales are like, whoa, like way over here. And then the Clone Wars is kind of like the tipping point where things just collapse. Right. There's a quote from an interview that George Lucas did in 1999 for a magazine. I think it was Time magazine.
It's a good year.
1999. And he talks specifically about how Anakin's fall unbalances the Force. And first of all, I mean, that alone is like really, that's a big deal to me, because I love that idea that his fall unbalances the Force and his rise balances the Force again. But that also shows that the presence of Sith, at least to George Lucas, is not inherent to unbalancing the Force. And it shows that for the 1,000 years before 32 BBY, the Force was in balance, even though the Sith were kind of in the shadows and preparing to unbalance it. So, I think that's a big deal to me, because that means that, at least to George, there is some other level to balancing the Force than just simply Sith or no Sith.
Yeah.
And I know that this was like a weird tangent I just went on that has,
no,
I don't even remember how I came up with it. But
it all started with,
the galaxy,
when did you start liking
mythology
and Star Wars? But it's good. Keep going.
But the way I look at it, the galaxy kind of represents an organism in and of itself, because the Force is life itself. And the Force binds the galaxy together, binds every living thing together. And there's an energy, a force that exists that the galaxy can either be at peace with or not. And the Sith, or the dark side, in overabundance is a bad thing. The dark side exists naturally. It has to. When Luke is talking to Rey in The Last Jedi, we see, there's things like death and decay are naturally dark. There's a natural dark side cave on Dagobah. There's a natural dark side cave underneath Ahch-To. Death and suffering are inherent. You can never eliminate them completely, but you can minimize them. And it's the same way, it's like in our bodies. We have an immune system that fights an overabundance of bad things. And the same way within ourselves, an overabundance of, crassness and anger and jealousy and rage can unbalance us. It's the same way with the galaxy. They're one and the same. So when Anakin finally finds peace and balances himself, the galaxy finally finds peace and balances itself. And when Ben Solo falls to the dark side, the galaxy, falls to the dark side.
All comes
because
back,
now we have an abundance of dark side influence again. I don't know if I'm doing the best job of explaining those principles.
I think you are. But from here, I think it's good we brought up the prequels a lot. We tapped into the sequels a bit there. We can get back to it in a few, but I think from here we can go into kind of like the meat and potatoes, if you will, of mythology's influence on Star Wars, and that's The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, which that's like, I don't want to say it's like the Bible
faces.
It is.
It was George Lucas's Bible.
Yeah,
for sure.
Which is all that matters when it comes to Star Wars. So
when writing the original trilogy, George at some point read Hero with 1,000 Faces, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which is the book that Joseph Campbell introduces the concept of the hero's journey in. He read that, he sat down, and he wrote, in Joseph Campbell's own words, the greatest kind of amalgamation of the hero's journey in Luke Skywalker's arc in the original trilogy. Luke Skywalker's arc in the original trilogy is the perfect kind of like realization of the hero's journey post hero's journey, because obviously the hero's journey specifically is about a series of patterns that we see in a lot of myths. It's called the monomyth, and it's basically this idea that every mythological story, every mythology kind of has the same kind of arc, the same patterns. Our heroes face very similar trials and do very similar things from start to finish, and it's a cycle. Our hero starts somewhere and ends in the same place, but now changed. That's kind of the idea behind it.
Yeah.
And if you look at Luke Skywalker, if you look at Paul Atreides in Dune, if you look at Frodo Baggins in Lord of the Rings, in Harry Potter, in the Harry Potter franchise, all of these characters go through a very archetypal, very obvious hero's journey that you can pinpoint from beginning to end and bullet point the things that they do. That, the refusal of the call to adventure, the trials, the magic in the road, basically like the mysterious mentor figure who dies and leaves the hero kind of alone to face the villain, the atonement with the father, which is why Star Wars is the best, because the atonement with the father is such a big deal. The father kind of is a representation of adulthood. Most heroes' journeys are specifically about coming of age. And once again, look at the people I mentioned. Luke Skywalker, who's 19 and then turns 23 at the end of Return of the Jedi. Paul Atreides, who is like a teenager. I don't exactly know how old he is, but he's young. Harry Potter, who is 11 at the beginning of his journey. Frodo, who is a young guy in his journey. And they all kind of grow up and cross the threshold into adulthood by the end of their journey. And again, that's kind of where it is. You start at one place, you end in the same place, but changed. You've evolved. And usually that comes with a certain level of like disillusionment with the past, kind of like break from childhood. And it helps to mention that the hero with the 1,000 faces, not a lot of people realize this because a lot of people don't read the book. But if you buy the book like I did and then read it and be like, wait a minute, it's a self-help guide. It's not like it's an academic source, but it's a self-help book. And he like tells you, he kind of uses the hero's journey to match your own. Like you're supposed to latch on to the hero's journey and kind of say like, oh, that's me, I'm doing that. Oh, I'm crossing the threshold, I'm atoning with the father, I'm going on these trials. And obviously they're not the same thing because I'm not going around slaying orcs, but you're supposed to equate certain things with certain other things in the book, and kind of go on your own hero's journey. Now I will say that is an incredibly outdated idea. This book was written in like the 50s.
Genius.
Don't follow it as a self-help guide, please. And even nowadays, people challenge the hero's journey, and I think there is a certain degree of truth with that. Joseph Campbell, he kind of just looked at Jesus's arc in the Bible and was like, oh yeah, I see that and this and that and this and that. And he kind of twisted things to kind of make them fit. It's not perfect, and it's not a perfect science, but the monomyth does fit pretty well with a lot of different things in the past. A lot of Greek mythology, Jason and the Argonauts, Oedipus, that's a big one. Oedipus, he was like obsessed with Oedipus. That's another, atonement with the father. If you know anything about Oedipus, you know that's kind of where he probably got the concept. But yeah, there's just, and nowadays people sort of take the monomyth and say, well, I'm going to write my own mythology and follow those steps to kind of, it's kind of like a cheat sheet or like the quick and easy path to making your own mythology, is to follow the hero's journey. And that isn't to say that's a bad thing. Joseph Campbell has some pretty outdated ideas, I want to say. But he's like an old white dude from the 50s. Of course he has some,
of course it's gonna be outdated.
Outdated things. Like they weren't hitting 100 back then.
So recently, and I know you've been working on a separate project for the channel. Eventually, you've gotten into the heroine's journey, and you were explaining all that to me and that whole deal. I think this could be a good jumping point into that.
This is a good jumping point to it because I'll tell you the origins of the book, The Heroine's Journey. So Joseph Campbell writes Hero with a Thousand Faces and releases it in the 50s, becomes a big hit, becomes a self-help guide for a lot of men. Probably not the best, but it happened. So there you go. And George Lucas was probably one of those people. In the 80s, one of his students by the name of Maureen Murdoch approaches Joseph Campbell, sits down and says, well, what about the woman? What about the feminine? Because actually, I shouldn't say what about the woman. I should say what about the feminine? Because there are these things in mythology called masculine principles and feminine principles. Feminine principles are more about creation and creativity and artistry. Masculine principles are more about power and justice, very like hard, rigid things, while femininity is more like fluid. And again, this all has to do with like psychology and like all this stuff. It's very complex, and I am
above our pay grade,
trying really hard to just like explain it on like a stream of consciousness level without going on like 20 tangents. Anyway, long story short, she sat down, she said, the hero's journey is very masculine. It has a lot of masculine principles, but what about the feminine principles? Because she was a psychologist, just like Joseph Campbell was, and she specifically one for women. So she sat down and talked to a lot of women and noticed patterns in the stories she was hearing and the dreams that she was hearing. The hero's journey and the heroine's journey talk a lot about dreams. And again, reading dreams is like complete poppycock. I don't want to say like your dreams mean things. Subconscious is a whole other topic, but I won't go into that. But anyway, she notices these patterns in her patients. She notices these patterns in these patients, and she approaches Joseph Campbell with this list of patterns and other things, and she says, I believe I can kind of figure out like the feminine side of the hero's journey. Instead of masculine, it's feminine. And he looked at her and he said, well, no, because the woman is the goal of the man. The woman can't go on a hero's journey because the woman is simply the end goal for the man to reach. Again, we're talking about a white guy from the 50s, and we're specifically talking about very rigid gender roles in terms of like the man, when he comes of age, he has to find a woman and get married and all that jazz. It's how his brain worked. And Maureen Murdoch did not like that at all, and rightfully so, because that's like a ridiculous statement.
Yeah.
Right. That women can't go on their own journeys with their own feminine principles because they're just simply like an object to be won at the end of like a contest. I mean, that's, ridiculous, and that's stupid. And again, that's part of the list of things that Joseph Campbell has said that aren't entirely kosher nowadays.
Yeah.
So she turned around and she said, fine, I'll just write my own book. And she did. She wrote The Heroine's Journey as kind of like a mirror to the hero's journey. And when you read into the heroine's journey, it was like mind-boggling. And I'm not the first person to think about this, and I don't want to pretend I was. But, when you hear other people say like, oh, Rey's arc in the sequels is actually the heroine's journey, not the hero's journey. You hear that, but you don't really think about it until you actually sit down and read this friggin' thing. I mean, I read this friggin' book. And I have it like on my computer right now. And it's like burning a hole in my friggin' hard drive. But it's wild. I mean, it boggles my mind because I see so many YouTubers and I see so many creatives who clearly know what they're talking about when it comes to Star Wars, and clearly know what they're talking about when it comes to these kind of more academic readings and the hero's journey and the monomyth and stuff like that. They know this stuff intrinsically, like very strongly. And they just don't see Rey's journey as the heroine's journey. I see so many people complain that Rey's arc is either a copy of Luke's arc, but worse. So the hero's journey, but like poorly managed, mismanaged, or that she doesn't have an arc, that she doesn't grow or change over the course of the movies. And obviously I think that cannot be further from the truth. And back in the day, in 2018, 2019, when sequel discussion was at its zenith. Yeah, right. Back in the day, it feels like forever ago.
It does.
But back then, talking about Rey's arc, at least for me, was always about she does not grow physically stronger in the same terms as Luke and Anakin do, going from, you know, an untrained child to a Jedi master, or in Anakin's case, so close to a master. That's not her journey. It's emotional. She goes through a very clear emotional evolution and growth and change. And that's like on page 1. The heroine's journey is all about emotional growth. And it's like, it was such like a light bulb moment when I was able to like connect the statement of like Rey's arc is emotional to, holy shit, there's actually a whole thing about that. And it's called the heroine's journey.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've been having a blast reading it. I've been having a blast kind of writing this video. Hopefully I'm not eating my words and the video actually comes out. So I'm not looking back at this.
It'll come out eventually.
Being like,
maybe
maybe
you're watching this and it's already out at some time, but yeah.
Hopefully.
Should be a good video. Should be great.
We'll link it in the description.
This is a teaser for it.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
So when was the heroine's journey published?
1990.
Okay.
So I said she approached Joseph Campbell in the 80s. And he actually, and it's funny, in an interview, Joseph Campbell actually talked about that specific interaction he had. And he makes like an off-color like joke about like, oh, I'm glad I'm retiring because I'm tired of this new age thinking. I'm like, get the hell out of here, man. Come on. I love Joseph Campbell, but come on, dude. You cannot be saying that stupid bullshit. So she published it in 1990.
Yeah.
And that kind of, and again, it's a self-help book. It's very much a self-help book. It definitely gets into a lot of weird stuff about like dreams and like other things that I'm like, okay, that's a little.
Where do you stand on dreams?
No, I don't. Dreams are just
meaningless.
Yeah, basically. I mean, they're not meaningless per se. They're your brain kind of sorting and filing through information that it received throughout the day or the week or whatever. There's certain bits that are kind of sitting in your subconscious that
don't eat chocolate before bed. Kind of might get nightmares.
Filing away. Is that true? I don't even know.
I think it might be, but I read about it. But
I don't put any stock into dreams. I don't have like a dream book or anything like that. And I personally don't think any of the dream analyses in this book are particularly good or prescient.
Which is interesting that it's funny you bring that up because that makes me think of Star Wars. Back to Star Wars here.
Well, there you go.
When Jedi have dreams or visions, you know, like the person that receives them is like, oh shit, I have to go help this person. But
yeah,
the master is usually like, hey, like don't look too far into that. That might just be close to the truth, but maybe not, you know, like be deceiving.
As Obi-Wan says, dreams pass in time. And it's true.
Yeah.
You don't want to act on dreams without having the full context of them.
Yeah.
Now, in Star Wars, you know, people always talk about like when Yoda says like, oh, the future is cloudy. It's like, that's true. But it's more or less how that dream is reached as opposed to whether or not the dream will actually happen. So I always, it kind of balances. It's kind of like a tightrope of like predestination and like free choice. Star Wars always kind of balances that ever since the prophecy of the Chosen One was kind of introduced. You know, I like the prophecy of the Chosen One. I love that stuff. I think the prophecy of the Chosen One is taken a little too seriously in the fandom. I think a lot of people put an overemphasis on it. But I like it's biblical, you know. And again, I'm that kind of guy who like eats up the stupid, you know, patterns and allusions, literary allusions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But you have to ask, like the prophecy of the Chosen One, did Anakin actually have free will or not when doing it? If he was always destined to do it.
It's a good question.
And that, I mean, and the whole thing about predestination and free will, that's like the question. That's like the age-old question that philosophy was invented to kind of figure out. So it's not like I'm the one sitting here going like, ooh.
Do you believe in destiny?
No.
So you don't believe in dreams. You don't believe in destiny. You believe in destiny in Star Wars.
To a certain extent. I think I'm somewhere in the middle, which is like a weird thing. I'm like the Bendy.
Do you believe in density?
This. Yeah. You are my density.
Back to the Future.
Milk. Chocolate.
So back to, I don't know why I have this question, but when you think of dreams in Star Wars, what character do you think of?
Anakin.
I think of Ezra.
Yeah. I love
I feel like he has a lot of dreams.
Ezra's dream is probably one of my favorite examples of Jedi prophecy or Jedi, seeing the future, because I think that's like the purest kind of way to show it. Anakin sees his wife suffering, but it's kind of murky and he doesn't exactly understand it. But Ezra sees these events and then does not understand how those events are reached, and thinks he comes to those conclusions on his own. He comes to the conclusion that there's only one way for these things to happen, and then they happen. And I think that is kind of why I'm in the middle of the predestiny kind of thing, because you can see the end goal, but you can't see how you got there, the choices you made, or anything like that. If Anakin saw his death, right, before episode 6, if he's Darth Vader and he's sitting down in his little goldfish bowl with his helmet off, cross-legged, dreaming of things, and he sees himself die at the hands of Luke Skywalker, which actually I think that happens in the comics, funny enough, now that I'm mentioning that. But
yeah, that sounds familiar.
He sees that end result, but he doesn't see how he got there. And so he's predestined to die at that point, but what he does before that, how he dies, is completely his choice. Because as Darth Vader, he might think when he sees himself die, oh, Luke kills me in a duel, and I have to prevent that. And again, that's kind of what happens in the comics, I believe. He sees Luke kill him, and then I think he gets like scared that Luke falls to the dark side because Luke kills him. And he doesn't understand that it's actually Luke who saves him, and that he doesn't die at the hands of Luke. He dies because of Luke, but only because Luke is the one who inspired him to kind of return to the light. And so, again, I think we're somewhere in the middle where you can make the choices that lead to the thing you saw. And that's kind of, that plays into predestination of free will, and kind of, like I said, finds yourself in a bit of a gray area there. But that's kind of why I don't think
Gray Jedi?
Prophecy. No,
No, just kidding.
No Gray Jedi, and
No
don't
Gray
even get
Jedi.
me started on that. That's a topic for another video,
day.
because I'll go on and on about Gray Jedi, how they're bad and not a thing.
Do you have anything more on Hero's Journey or Heroine's Journey before our next little segue here? I mean, the next segment here will involve all that anyways. We can
so we can always just and
wanted to get into your boy
King Arthur. All right, good.
And other mythological influences, whatever you
mythologies, other things.
So the floor is yours with King Arthur.
Oh, you just want me to talk about King Arthur? Well, okay.
Of course.
So like I said earlier, we have Star Wars, and we have all of these. We have Buddhist, Taoist, Stoic influences. We have World War II movies that George Lucas grew up watching. We have sci-fi serials like Flash Gordon. Star Wars was supposed to be a Flash Gordon movie before he couldn't get the rights to it, and he started writing Star Wars. We have the fact that so much of the first Star Wars movie seems to lend itself to Dune, from the fact that it takes place mostly on a desert planet, to the fact that there's a thing called spice. Like, George literally just ripped off Dune and was like, I'm just going to make Dune because no one's ever going to make Dune, so I'll just make Dune. And he made Star Wars, and it's literally just Dune. Samurai movies, again, I tell you, cowboy movies and samurai movies are hand in hand. World War II movies, like I said, that he grew up watching. Sci-fi serials. Wizard of Oz, Wizard of Oz, for crying out loud, is the same kind of thing. That's a hero's journey. I think actually that falls closer to the heroine's journey. Reading in the book, she talks a lot about like Alice in Wonderland as a heroine's journne. There's a couple of other things she talks about as our heroine's journeys, but it's cool to kind of recontextualize those things. But anyway, one of those influences has to be King Arthur and just the classic Knight's Tale. In the 60s, The Once and Future King was a novel that was released that kind of retold the Arthurian mythos for a new generation. There always seems to be like a reinvention of the Arthurian mythos every like 50 or 60 years. All of a sudden he just like kind of pops up in the pop culture again, and everybody talks about him and is like, whoa. I think The Winter King is like the most recent set of novels that came out, and they recently just got adapted to like an MGM Plus show that I kind of want to check out, but it's like totally different. MGM Plus, that's a thing.
That's a thing?
That's a thing. Do you know that? it used to be like Encore or like Stars or like Epics. I think it might have been Epics. I forget. It's one of those channels like rebranded as MGM Plus. But anyway, they're doing The Winter King, which is the most recent novels that are kind of like adapting the Arthurian mythos. But back in the 60s, The Once and Future King came out, heavily influential on King Arthur. You ever see The Sword and the Stone, the Disney movie?
I have, yeah.
That's an adaptation of The Once and
Classic.
Future King. Most of the stuff in that movie, like Merlin experiencing time backwards, and like Arthur being called Wart when he's like a farmhand, and like being turned into animals and stuff like that. None of that happens in the myths. That is all an invention of the Once and Future King novel series.
Disappointing.
And The Sword and the Stone is an adaptation of the first novel, The Once and Future King, in that series. Something else that was influenced by The Once and Future King was the play Camelot, which is adapted into the movie Camelot. And I will get into that in a second, but we'll get back to Camelot in a bit. But there was a big resurgence in popularity of King Arthur in the 1960s. And by 77, you could clearly tell that George had read Once and Future King at some point, or had tapped into the zeitgeist that was King Arthur. Because on a very broad basis, Luke Skywalker's arc is very Arthurian. You have, the farm boy who never knew his parents, who kind of idolized his dad, although he doesn't know who he was, being guided by this mystical hermit wizard. He gives him this magical sword that is his birthright, right? He's destined to get this sword. It's the lightsaber. At some point, on his trials, he loses the sword in a fight, and he kind of it breaks, and he kind of feels like he's lost all. And again, that's exactly what happens in Empire Strikes Back. Fun thing, because I'm thinking about the I Am Your Father twist. King Arthur is actually a product of a forbidden relationship. That's a little iffy. So Merlin, Arthur's name is Uther Pendragon, and there's like this conquering Welsh king who I forget his name. He's encroaching on Uther Pendragon's lands, and Uther like shows up to fight him, and then sees his wife, and he's like, "Holy crap!" He basically does like the Looney Tunes, like "Auga," like his eyes like bulge out of his head, and he's like, "Ooh!" He goes absolutely nuts. And he goes to Merlin, because Merlin at this time was his advisor. He goes to Merlin, and he's like, "Hey, Merlin, I really like this lady, and I want to have sex with her." And Merlin's like, "I got you." So Merlin disguises Uther as this rival. So Uther looks like the guy whose wife he loves, and he sneaks into the castle, and they they have sex, and that's how Arthur is born. So again, it's like this. It's almost like this forbidden romance. I don't know if you really call it a romance, but forbidden relations,
forbidden stuff,
spawn King Arthur the same way forbidden relations spawn Luke. Now, of course, Arthur does have a sister, Morgan Le Fay, and
who's a witch.
Yeah, who's a witch, and Arthur and Morgan do get it on. So very Luke and Leia reminiscent,
kind of.
It's God. There's so much weird shit in mythology.
There's weird stuff in Star Wars too, but not quite as weird.
So anyway, I believe the sword is lost in a fight with Lancelot, and that's a whole thing. Arthur brings Lancelot into his court. He reforges Excalibur. He creates the Knights of the Round Table in Camelot, and he's like, "Whoa, I finally did it. I've become like the greatest knight ever, and I'm the king, and my wife loves me." And of course, his wife is having an affair with Lancelot. That's like the big thing in Arthurian mythology, is that Lancelot and Guinevere, Arthur's wife, have an affair behind his back. And at some point he finds out about it, but he doesn't want anybody to know about it. So anybody who even speaks about it, he like challenges to a duel, or like kind of like takes them to court, because like the whole idea was like Arthur is the inventor of like due process, basically. Like he's the one who invented like the court system, and And all these knights are like, wait, we can't just kill people who like insult us anymore. He's like, no, we have to take them to court, and it's a trial by peers, and it's all this stuff. You have to have evidence. And anybody who says that Lancelot and Guinevere are having an affair, he's like, no, I hate this, and it's stupid. And he like basically locks himself in his tower. He's pissed off and doesn't want to talk to anybody. He grows very disillusioned with knights. He has to fight Lancelot at some point to regain his honor because the rumor becomes too widespread. And that's kind of when he relinquishes knighthood, and he's like, forget this. Knighthood sucks, and I hate it. And he has Percival. Sorry. He has Percival, who is like one of his like up and coming knights, toss the sword in the ocean. And he's like, forget it. Get Excalibur out of here. Get my legacy means nothing. I hate everything.
Tossing a sword, eh?
Tossing a sword. Yes. Where am I going with this? I don't. Who knows? Anyway, you remember how I said that Arthur and Morgan got it on at some point? Well, Arthur has a son nephew named Mordred, an evil nephew who kind of shows up and is like, I'm going to mess everything up for you. I'm going to destroy Camelot. I'm going to march on Camelot with my armies, and there's nothing you can do about it because you're a withered old man who is not heroic anymore, and I hate you. And Arthur, basically has to get back into the knight game and say like, no, forget this. I am a knight. I'm a hero. I created Camelot. I created all this great stuff. People remember me fondly and love me. And I'm going to have to face this with a bang. So he gets Excalibur from the lady in the lake. He marches to the Battle of Camlan, and fighting his evil nephew, he kills his evil nephew and he dies. And he is, because these are Christian tales, these are actually Christian and pagan tales mixed together. So it's infinitely fascinating, the kind of like weird stuff that you find, like the Green Knight, who's like this big green guy who decapitates himself and like can just take his head off, and he's like, hey, it's great. It's awesome. Like I love that kind of stuff. But anyway, he kills Mordred. He dies in battle, and the angels come and whisk him away to a magical island called Avalon. And that's the end of King Arthur's tale. And everybody, kind of looks back at the time he existed as Camelot, and it was like this big, beautiful thing. And of course, that's just Luke Skywalker's arc.
Yeah.
Like from start to finish. And again, all of these incredibly smart people who know Star Wars and know the hero's journey and know King Arthur so well. I know they do because they talk about it when they examine the original trilogy, just refuse to see that in the sequel trilogy. Literally, Rian Johnson, in an interview, basically stated that his influence was King Arthur outright in The Last Jedi. And it couldn't be any more clear, to me at least. And if you watch Camelot, I'm going to make a video about this too. This is actually the second on my list after the heroine's journey thing. I'm going to make a video comparing The Last Jedi to Camelot and the movie Excalibur from the 1980s, 1981 or 2, I think. I just recently watched it, so it's like fresh in my head. But if you watch Camelot, the end of the film is he's reinvigorated. He's ready to fight. He's fighting Lancelot. The Camelot ends with him fighting Lancelot. But Mordred is in the movie too. It's just it's mixed up a little bit, and most Arthurian myths aren't perfectly aligned with each other. But anyway, he's getting ready to fight Lancelot, and in the grouping, he's like super depressed. He's staring off. He's like, I hate everything. I can't believe I have to do this. This sucks. I hate knights. Knights suck. Everything about this sucks. Then all of a sudden, this kid comes up to him and is like, wow, you're my favorite hero, and I love you so much. And then King Arthur's like, you do? Oh my God. And he's like, yeah, Camelot's awesome. And I love being a knight, and I love knights because they're heroic and they save people, and I love you. You're great. And he's like, and he sings a song because it's a musical. But he basically like anoints this kid. He's like, you're a knight now too, sir. I think his name is like Ed or something like that. And he's
Sir
like,
Ed.
now go home and tell everybody that King Arthur is fighting for you and all this stuff. And that's how the movie ends. And that just blew.
That's Broom Boy.
The skull, like off the back of my head completely. exploded because exactly that's Broom Boy. I was like, holy shit! Like, there's no way that Rian Johnson didn't watch Camelot and Excalibur for that matter. In Excalibur, King Arthur discovers he outright discovers the Lancelot Guinevere affair, and he has a moment, literally looking at them in bed, hovering over them, holding the sword, looking down, and we see the sword in the foreground and them in the background, and he doesn't, and he stabs like in the middle of them, so they're both like hugging each other, but he stabs like right between them so they don't get impaled, but they wake up and they see Excalibur stabbed between them. And that's kind of like their wake up moment where Guinevere's like, I'm going to become a nun. That's a whole thing. But
they slept through that. They just were like, the sword got stabbed between them and they didn't wake up.
Dude, they were busy getting it on in the woods. And
so they were very really tired.
Very tired.
I see.
Lancelot's very tired. There's even a moment in Camelot where Lancelot, what's the word? What's the jousts? Where Lancelot jousts with Sir something or other, Sir Leon, I think his name is, or something like that. Anyway, he jousts with this guy and he wrecks him, destroys him, he dies. And Lancelot's like, oh my God, I feel so bad. And he sits down, he prays, and the guy comes back to life. And I'm like, Jesus, that's Ray. Like that's Ben and Ray. Like, I mean, there's so much to it. There's so much. Like, I tell you right now, if you want to enjoy at least The Last Jedi, and you don't already, watch Camelot, watch Excalibur, watch where these choices were made, because The Last Jedi was not just created in a vacuum. Rian Johnson did not sit down and write this to be like, I hate Luke. He wrote it to specifically mirror mythology. And mythology, the hero's journey, is a coming-of-age story, right? I discussed that earlier. Yeah. Well, what happens to these heroes after they come of age? You know, most of them don't ride off into the sunset. If you've ever read King Arthur or Beowulf, or there's other things. There's other things out there that I'm not thinking of right away, like Oedipus. Or Odysseus, you know, when Odysseus goes on his trials in the Odyssey, he comes back and he does not have a good time. Once a hero gets older, there is a specific pattern we find where they do not really achieve everything they wanted to, and they kind of grow disillusioned, or they kind of grow bored. And there's like one last like going out with a bang moment where they find their vigor and they're like, yes, like I'm back, here we go. And then they kind of go out in a blaze of glory, and that kind of inspires the next generation to fight in their stead. And I remember reading Beowulf.
Christopher Nolan's Batman.
Christopher Nolan's Batman.
I don't know why. That's in my head recently. So.
Dude, that's a perfect example. Look at what happens in Christopher Nolan's Batman. Bruce Wayne becomes a hermit, recluse, whose body is like completely broken by his exploits, and then dies and gets to live his perfect life in Italy with his hot girlfriend, while Robin, you know, has to take up the mantle.
Inspired. Yeah.
It's the exact same thing. And that's just a classic story. That's a classic thing. And that was like a perfect example that I didn't even think of, like off the top of my head.
I have no idea why it popped into my head. We've been watching those recently, and that I thought of that. I'm always thinking Batman secretly. So
there you go.
So we've really got into mythology and Star Wars, obviously, here, and Matt could go on for days and days and days. But yeah, you know, I was going to ask you about references people that are listening or watching could go check, whether it's the books, which are very dry and people probably don't want to read those, you know, the hero's journey, the heroine's journey. If you want to look up like the spark notes of them, it's cool.
Do that.
The films you just mentioned would be cool to check out. I need to check those out, a few of those out myself. But I want to get into themes as well. And the first one I wanted to start with was like redemption and hope, because I think the major themes in Star Wars are like redemption, hope, family, found family, whatever. Like those are the ones I think of, at least. Like, I don't know if you want to dive into that next.
Redemption, hope, found family, and I would say the other one is letting go of your fear of loss.
Yeah.
That's a huge one. And in fact, I think actually, in my opinion, letting go, which is usually the final trial in any of our heroes in Star Wars, they all have to let go of their fear of loss. and that not that they, you know, they don't always do that. Look at Anakin. But I would say that's the most important theme in Star Wars, I think, is dealing with death and being able to kind of let go of your fear of loss, let go of your grief. You can grieve. Grieving is healthy. The Jedi grieve. I want to make that abundantly clear. We see that in the High Republic. They grieve. For crying out loud, we see them grieve in the movies. Why do you think they burn Obi-Wan's body? If they didn't care about that kind of stuff, they'd toss his body in the trash like Danny DeVito.
Qui-Gon.
Did I say Obi-Wan?
Yeah.
I meant Qui-Gon.
We don't know what happens to Obi-Wan's body, or we do.
We do. He ascends because he becomes enlightened, because he adheres to the non-attachment principles of Buddhism and becomes enlightened. And that ties into Christian mythology, because ghosts, you don't become a ghost when you become enlightened in Buddhism, but you become a ghost when you become enlightened in Star Wars. And that has to do with letting go. And I really cannot hammer that home enough. Obi-Wan, Return of the Jedi, The Last Jedi, and the most recent example would be Ahsoka. Yeah. All of our heroes have to, you notice this more and more now. They revisit their old masters. They have to learn to let go of whatever grief or trauma they're holding on to, and that's how they ascend. That's how they become enlightened. Anakin fails that test. And I see a lot of this. The attachment, specifically, George Lucas's version of attachment in Star Wars is more aligned with the Buddhist principle of non-attachment than it is what people think attachment is, which is simply just like love. It is not love. Attachment and love are not synonymous with each other in Star Wars. And I want to make that very clear. I mean, the texts, the prequels make that very clear. Even the Clone Wars and like all the novels set during that time period make that very clear. Like, love and attachment are not the same thing. Jedi battle scars. Nobody talks about Jedi battle scars. Yeah. I want to talk about Jedi battle scars.
I've said this a
million times already. You're probably getting sick of hearing it, but I want to say it again. That book has the greatest definition of attachment I've ever heard in Star Wars, where Cal Kestis realizes that the difference between love and attachment is when you love somebody, you are willing to sacrifice yourself for them, but you also understand that they would do the same for you, and you understand that you're okay with that. And again, that ties into letting go and the fear of loss. Attachment, you would not let them die for you. You will do everything you can to prevent their death, which is Anakin. Anakin fails the test. The prequels are not about how the Jedi are wrong for their non-attachment. The prequels are about how the non-attachment principle is good, and if you don't follow the rules, you become an asshole and kill children. That is what the prequels are about. Anakin is the poster child for why the non-attachment principle is a good thing. And I know that's like a really controversial thing to say, because right now, like, a very popular read of the prequels is that the Jedi are like bad and wrong, and Luke Skywalker changed the Jedi rules to be, better, because now in his Jedi, you can get married and you can love, and everybody loves each other. And it's like, no. That was not right. And I know a lot of people got mad when Luke, reveals that he follows the non-attachment principles in Book of Boba Fett. But my statement to that is, Dave Filoni wrote that episode. You cannot be surprised if Dave Filoni is following in what George Lucas specifically intended to write with the prequels. Now, you are allowed to read the prequels however you want. Yeah. Everybody's reading of Star Wars is valid in their own way. And I do not want to diminish that and say that my reading is more important or better or more correct than anyone else's. But I do think George intended to write the prequels with a specific message in mind. And I do think Dave Filoni is following that when he continues Luke's Academy in that same vein. And I just think you can't be surprised by that. Dave Filoni is going to follow what George Lucas did. Now, George Lucas and Dave Filoni do disagree on a number of things, but again, that could be a whole other video that I could go into on.
That'd be a good one. Yeah,
because there's a lot. Dave Filoni is way more harsh on the Jedi than George Lucas is. Like, very harsh on the Jedi. Not
George was
Karen
chill.
Travis levels, but George is pretty chill on the Jedi.
George
He
was
actually
super chill.
he likes them. I would say the only two mistakes the Jedi ever make in the prequels, if you look at it by just what George does, is they should not have let the war dehumanize them too much. They got too wrapped up in the war, in the Clone Wars, yeah, and they trained Anakin. The mistake.
The only two things.
That is the only two things. It's a big
major
only two
things.
But those are the only two mistakes. People always couple the Jedi saying like, oh, they became too like arrogant or dogmatic or, you know, too detached from the galaxy. That's all Filoni. Filoni kind of expanded on that and drew those flaws out more with the Clone Wars. And of course, that was under George's supervision. So we can't just say that George was completely separate from that. But I do think Dave Filoni and George have very different readings on the Jedi. And that's, like I said, I could talk about examples and stuff like that forever. But yeah.
I will say.
Letting go.
Yeah. I will say I like Filoni's, if that is more so Filoni's thoughts on it. I like his angle of that, how they kind of lost their way a bit.
Makes it more interesting. I think the Jedi lost their way in the war, for sure. And if you read Inquisitor, Rise of the Red Blade, you'll learn a lot about that. Yeah. That book was so brilliant on showing just how the Jedi lost their way, and in keeping with a more George Lucasian interpretation of the prequels. Like it very much keeps in that whole like they lost their way because of the war, they let the war mess with them too much kind of way. But it doesn't rag on the Jedi dogma or the Jedi teachings. It does, but you have to remember that it's told through the point of view of somebody who is inherently like anti-Jedi. Like they already start with a negative mindset, and they're already not meeting the Jedi where they need to be met to understand them. So you have to remember that when it rags on the Jedi from a lot of different points of view, or from that one point of view, I should say, it's the one point of view as a person who is going to eventually go on to murder children. So you have to remember that.
Yeah, that's true.
You have to remember that like Anakin's point of view is not the correct one. He is the villain. He is the guy who ends up being the bad guy.
And that's also to go to the sequel trilogy. People always think like let the past die is the theme of Last Jedi or the sequels, even if you want to go that far, but it's not, because he's the bad guy. Kylo Ren's the bad guy.
Exactly. And if you look at Luke Skywalker's critiques of the Jedi, what does he say? He says that Palpatine used the war to make them lose their way, and they trained Anakin, and he became Darth Vader. And again, those are the 2 points that George Lucas, I think, messed up with. And of course, The Last Jedi has absolutely nothing to do with how the Jedi stink, right, or are bad, or anything like that. The Last Jedi is a complete and total celebration of the Jedi. Luke Skywalker is wrong when he is a cynical old man. He is wrong, and Rey is the audience stand-in for all of our different points of view on the Jedi. And I think, for me, The Last Jedi sort of kind of critiques that very popular reading of the prequels that I talked about earlier, that like the Jedi are like bad and the dogma stinks and all that jazz. I think Luke becomes too attached to the dogma, and he lets go in Return of the Jedi. Obviously, his fear of loss for Leia, he lets go of that. He ascends to become the quintessential Jedi when he does let go, and then of course Anakin does the same in his image, just like Luke says, I am a Jedi like my father before me. Anakin then kind of looks at that ideal and says, you're right, I am a Jedi. And so they kind of influence each other and they save each other. But then Luke goes on to become attached to the Jedi religion, so much so that he is willing to kill his nephew to save it, before he kind of realizes, that he had grown too attached to the Jedi religion, and so he tries to let go of it. But he actually the entire time on Ahch-To, he is totally attached to the Jedi, even though he hates them. It's kind of like this, like it's like this trapped mentality. I mean, obviously, Ahch-To kind of represents limbo, and Luke is kind of just like trapped in this world where he's attached to the Jedi religion, but he hates the Jedi religion. So damn it, you know, and then Yoda shows up, burns the tree and frees him, and he lets go and he ascends. And Octo goes from being Limbo to Avalon, and the Battle of Crate becomes the Battle of Camlan. And, you know,
there you go.
Kylo
There's
Ren is Mordred.
Full circle to the mythology parallels there. But so it seems like your favorite theme in Star Wars is letting go.
Absolutely.
And that letting fear of
loss.
Fear of
loss dictate your actions. That's what attachment is letting fear of loss dictate your attachments or dictate your actions.
The other, some of the other themes are obvious themes. I think the one Matt just kind of went into is probably, definitely of the Skywalker saga, at least one of the most important themes there is. The other one being redemption, which we can briefly talk about.
Anybody who seeks redemption can find it.
Yeah.
That does not mean that everybody can be redeemed. And I think there's a stark difference between the two, because I think when people talk about the Jedi being redeemers, and then turn around and say like, yeah, well, the Jedi kill people all the time. They don't give them a chance to be redeemed. But there is, even with like Palpatine, you have to be open to redemption. You have to want to change, and you have to want to become a better person. Palpatine doesn't want to become a better person. Palpatine wants to continue being evil. You know, he has absolutely no humanity in him whatsoever. So much so that one of my favorite details in The Rise of Skywalker that nobody talks about is how he just completely misinterprets Return of the Jedi. He just does not understand the concept of family. He doesn't understand the concept. Like, he thinks that like Luke only won because like Vader saved him, but he doesn't understand why Vader saved him. So like Rey is standing there and Palpatine was like, oh, your master was saved by his father, but I'm the only family you have. He just does not get, he does not get why Anakin saved Luke. He just cannot comprehend redemption, being a good person, wanting to be a good person. He cannot fathom it. And I don't think people give Rise of Skywalker enough credit for introducing that idea. That like, and that is a synthesis to the antithesis. And I forget the first step. There's a 3-step process in stories. But it's like the story, the antithesis, and the synthesis of it's the thesis. What am I doing? What am I talking about?
The most obvious one, yeah.
The thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And that line makes the Rise of Skywalker and the sequel trilogy a synthesis to that overarching theme of Palpatine is kind of just like the devil. And is just like an embodiment of evil and just cannot comprehend what family is. And family and the want to redeem yourself is the thing that pushes the light. And he just cannot figure that out. He cannot wrap his head around that. And
I think that's totally kind of random, but
what, Palpatine, my little thing, or
no, what I'm going to say is kind of random, based off of what you said, because it makes me think of it. It was something I really liked recently, that, Palpatine, as smart as he is with all of his schemes, he's dumb and doesn't realize, like, he's not a good person at all. He doesn't have one good bone in his body, or his clone shitty body. But like in Thrawn in Rebels, as smart as he is, when Ezra is sacrificing himself with the Purgle and getting the Chimera the hell out of there, Thrawn is like, hey, like, if you do this, like, you'll be gone too. And it's like, yeah, that's the point. Like,
that's the point.
He doesn't get it. Like, he's so selfish. Like, he doesn't get that Ezra is being selfless.
Exactly.
As smart as he is. So it's like,
selflessness is the most important thing, and that's why most of the time when we see characters ascend in Star Wars, it is because they have sacrificed themselves. Obi-Wan, Luke, Leia, Ben Solo, they all sacrifice themselves, and that is like the ultimate form. Selflessness in the ultimate form, letting go in the ultimate form. Kanan is another good example of somebody who is able to let go, who is able to kind of ascend. Now, not in the same way. He doesn't become a Force ghost, I don't think. Because I'm part of that group that thinks that only the people who are trained by Qui-Gon can become Force ghosts. And I don't think Kanan was trained by Qui-Gon.
I hope, I mean, you that's a good theory, but I hope that doesn't hold up. It would make sense if it did, but like
I wouldn't
I'd like
care either way. But right now, I just think it's like the line of the lineage of, kind of like Qui-Gon discovers this, and then Yoda goes through the trials in the Clone Wars, which is a great episode, by the way. And Yoda's trial in the Clone Wars perfectly mirrors Ahsoka's trial in Ahsoka and Obi-Wan's trial in Obi-Wan.
Yeah.
It's the same. It's like we're basically watching these characters be able to become Force ghosts right before our eyes, like reach enlightenment, basically. But Qui-Gon teaches Yoda, who then teaches Obi-Wan, who is then taught by Qui-Gon. And then and then Yoda most likely taught Luke along the way. It's kind of implied. And then, of course, Luke teaches Leia, and we can assume either Luke taught Ben, or I always like to think, since Leia stuck around until Ben died, Leia kind of ushered him into the netherworld of the Force.
Another beautiful,
which is absolutely
moment in Rise of Skywalker. It's like once Ben sacrifices himself to save Rey, and then both of them go with the Force. It's like Jay gets Jamie every time. She like brings a tear every time.
It's a beautiful moment. Beautiful moment.
Especially with
Star Wars,
the background with Carrie and all that too. And it's like that makes it real sad too. But it is so Star Wars. So I mean, but we don't see Ghost Ben Solo yet. So
no, we haven't seen him yet. We heard him
in the Lego Summer Special. I think he was, but yeah,
good.
Him and Leia, I think, were talking as ghosts or something. I don't know.
That's great. I like that.
But I mean, this has been quite the discussion. Obviously, we wish we could get to more.
I don't know if I call it a discussion. I hogged the mic.
Well, that was the plan.
I know that was the plan, but I always feel guilty when I just like ramble, stream of consciousness kind of thing.
Hey, it happens. And I think we're usually goofy, and people probably prefer that. I mean, we're still at our goofy moments, but usually people like our games and our goofy stuff. But this was a good contrast to show our range of talking Star Wars, I guess. I don't know. I feel like you guys will like this episode.
I hope they do.
Maybe you learned some things along the way. But I mean, we can get back into it another time. We can talk more, and there are more themes. We could do like a whole themes episode. And we could go across like every Star Wars project and talk about maybe influences and themes and stuff with it. And it's funny you bring up, like, I wanted to put this in at one point. But like you talk about Westerns and samurai movies and their influence on Star Wars, and that's basically what Star Wars is. But it's like they've made it so much more obvious now with Mandalorian.
They leaned into the Western samurai trappings so heavily, but they also leaned into the knight trappings, the Celtic mythology, pagan mythology, stuff like that. Like Ahsoka, it's just like knights. It's all knights.
Chock loaded with mythology,
chock loaded with Arthurian mythos and like knight lore, which Western. The cowboy is like the American warrior. The samurai is the Japanese warrior, and like the knight is the European warrior. Like
I always like when you bring that up. That's cool.
Each group of people on Earth has these sorts of romanticized warriors that were not at all like they are in the movies in real life. But somebody that is romanticized and deified, if you will, just like the Jedi, right? Again, today the Jedi are romanticized and deified, but if you strip away the legend and you look at the deeds, as Luke says in The Last Jedi.
Yeah.
So and again, that's like the same.
What is
thing.
that line? Gets me every time, like in a good way. To say the Force belongs to a Jedi.
To say if the light die, if the Jedi die, the light die, it's vanity. It's vanity.
Yeah, that's gold. I love that.
It is gold. That's such a beautiful line. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's brilliant.
It's art. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this episode. I know Matt did. He had a lot of fun. This is his wheelhouse. I enjoyed it too. I honestly do. Even though it's not like my thing I look for, I do enjoy listening to Matt talk about it. So I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. I'm sure you guys did. Be sure to like and subscribe this video. Subscribe. I already said subscribe for more content.
But don't click it again. No, don't click it again.
Yeah, don't unsubscribe. If you're listening to this, Jamie usually does this wrap up job, so I'm a little rusty. But if you're listening to this, we do have a YouTube page. We have a Patreon. If you guys want bonus content and want to support the show, if you're a fan, that would be much appreciated, of course.
Absolutely.
And we'll be back in the future to talk about more Star Wars. Go check out some of these things Matt mentioned if you're interested, and we will see you on the HoloNet. See you guys.
See ya.